I was setting up my makeshift chemistry lab when Superintendent Dr. Victoria Walsh walked into my storage room with two men I'd never seen before. The smell of bleach and old textbooks filled the cramped space as I arranged borrowed beakers on a folding table that had seen better days. "Dr. Martinez, these gentlemen are from the State Education Audit Division," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone administrators use when they're about to deliver bad news wrapped in bureaucratic language. I looked up from the box of expired lab supplies I'd been organizing, my hands still dusty from cleaning 30-year-old equipment that barely functioned. After 16 years teaching high school chemistry and physics at Lincoln Regional High School, I thought I'd heard every excuse for why our science program operated like it was stuck in the 1980s. "We need to discuss some irregularities in your recent grant funding," said the taller of the two men, whose name tag read State Inspector Davis. "The $100,000 National Science Foundation grant. The grant I'd spent 8 months writing. The grant that was supposed to transform our science program from a joke into something that could actually prepare students for 21st century careers. The grant that had supposedly been delayed in processing for the past 6 months. What kind of irregularities?" I asked, though my stomach was already sinking. Inspector Davis opened a manila folder and pulled out documents that made my blood run cold. Purchase orders for equipment I'd never seen. Invoices for materials that had never arrived. Receipts for laboratory supplies that definitely weren't sitting in my storage room/classroom. "According to our records, this grant money was fully expended on approved science equipment and materials," Davis said, scanning the papers. "But we're having trouble locating the actual items." I stared at the documents, feeling the weight of 16 years of fighting for my students pressing down on my shoulders. What I didn't know was that this moment would lead me to become the first teacher in state history to successfully sue the government for grant fraud, because I had filmed everything, every empty cabinet, every broken microscope. Every conversation where administrators had lied to my face about where my grant money had gone, and in 18 months I'd be standing in a federal courthouse with $2.3 million in damages awarded in my favor. Let me paint you the complete picture of Lincoln Regional High School and how I ended up in this nightmare. I'm Dr. Alina Martinez, and I've been teaching high school science since 2008. When I was 32 years old, with a PhD in chemistry from Stanford and dreams of inspiring the next generation of scientists. Lincoln Regional serves a rural district of 8,000 students, spread across 3 counties in Central California. Our main campus is a collection of buildings from the 1970s, with science labs that haven't been updated since Reagan was president. The chemistry lab has fume hoods that don't work, gas lines that have been shut off for safety reasons, and microscopes so old they belong in a museum. But despite the obstacles, I'd managed to create something special. My advanced placement chemistry students consistently scored above state averages. My physics class had sent 12 students to engineering programs at UC schools over the past 5 years. My environmental science course had won state recognition for our water quality research project that actually helped the county identify pollution sources. The success came from creativity born of desperation. When we couldn't afford proper lab equipment, I taught students to build their own spectroscometers using smartphone cameras and diffraction grating. When our computers crashed, we used online simulations and virtual labs. When textbooks were outdated, I created my own materials using current research and real-world applications. But there's only so much you can accomplish with duct tape and determination. 3 years ago, I decided to do something about our situation. I spent my summer vacation writing grant proposals, researching funding opportunities, and documenting the dire state of our science program. The National Science Foundation had announced a competitive grant program for rural schools, $100,000 for equipment and materials to enhance STEM education. I spent 8 months on that application. I documented every broken piece of equipment, every outdated textbook, every safety hazard in our labs. I created detailed budgets, wrote learning objectives, and designed implementation I included letters of support from parents, students, and local businesses who wanted to hire graduates with strong science backgrounds. The grant proposal was a masterpiece of educational planning. 247 pages documenting exactly how we would transform our science program and better serve our students. In March of last year, I received the notification that would change everything. Lincoln Regional High School had been awarded the full $100,000 for science education improvement. I actually cried tears of joy in my empty classroom, surrounded by the broken equipment that would finally be replaced. The celebration was shaped within a week of receiving the grant notification. Strange things started happening. Dr. Walsh called me into her office for what she described as a coordination meeting about the grant implementation. "Dr. Martinez, this is wonderful news for our district," she said, sitting behind her massive desk in an office that had been recently renovated with new carpet, furniture, and a 75-inch smart TV for presentations. "I'm excited to get started," I replied, pulling out my detailed implementation plan. "I've already contacted suppliers for the equipment we specified in the grant proposal." "Well, that's what I wanted to discuss," Walsh said, her tone shifting slightly. "Grant management is quite complex, with federal regulations and procurement requirements. The district will need to handle all purchasing and implementation to ensure compliance." "Of course," I said. "I understand there are procedures, but I wrote the grant proposal, so I know exactly what equipment we need and how it fits into our curriculum goals. Actually, the district's procurement office will determine the most cost-effective sources for equipment," said Janet Morrison, the business manager who'd apparently been invited to this meeting without my knowledge. "We have established vendor relationships that provide better pricing than what individual teachers might find." Something in their tone made me uncomfortable, but I wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt. These were experienced administrators who dealt with large budgets regularly. Maybe they did know better ways to stretch grant money. "How long will the procurement process take?" I asked. "The grant has timeline requirements for implementation and reporting. These things take time," Morrison said vaguely. "Federal procurement rules are very strict. We'll keep you informed as things progress." That was in April. By June, I hadn't heard anything about equipment orders or delivery time. When I asked Walsh about progress, she assured me everything was moving through the system and that equipment would arrive soon. August came and went. September arrived with a new school year, and my students were still using the same broken equipment. The same outdated textbooks, the same dangerous lab conditions that the grant was supposed to fix. "Dr. Walsh," I said during our October faculty meeting, "I need an update on the NSF grant equipment. My students are asking when they'll have access to the new microscopes and spectrophotometers we discussed." "Grant implementation is a complex process," she replied in front of the entire faculty. "These things can't be rushed if we want to maintain compliance with federal regulations." But I was starting to notice things that didn't add up. The district had somehow found money to renovate the administrative offices, complete with new furniture and technology. The football team had received new uniforms and equipment. The main office had installed an expensive new security system. Meanwhile, my chemistry students were still sharing 3 working microscopes among 24 kids, and I was still buying basic supplies with my own money. In November, I submitted a formal written request for information about the grant status. Morrison responded with a 2-sentence email. "Grant funds are being processed according to federal guidelines. Equipment procurement is in progress." By December, 6 months after receiving the grant, I was getting suspicious. I started asking more direct questions and keeping detailed records of every conversation about the missing equipment. That's when the excuses started getting creative. The breaking point came during a parent-teacher conference in January. Mrs. Chen, whose daughter was in my AP chemistry class, asked a question that hit me like a physical blow. "Dr. Martinez, Jenny mentioned that the school received a large science grant last year. When will students have access to the new equipment?" She's applying to competitive chemistry programs and wants to make sure she's getting proper lab experience. I looked at this concerned parent, whose daughter was brilliant and deserving of every opportunity, and I realized I couldn't keep covering for the district's lies. Mrs. Chen, that's an excellent question that I've been asking administration for months. Let me get back to you with specific information. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to document the truth about what had happened to our grant money. I started with a Freedom of Information Act request for all documents related to the NSF grant. What I received 3 weeks later was shocking. According to the district's own records, the grant money had been fully expended on science equipment and materials. The problem was, none of that equipment existed in my classroom or anywhere else in the school. I requested specific documentation, purchase orders, delivery receipts, inventory records. What I got back was a collection of documents that looked like they'd been created by someone who'd never seen a chemistry lab. Orders for spectroscopic analysis equipment that, when I researched the model numbers, turned out to be basic printers. Invoices for molecular modeling software that was actually Microsoft Office licenses for the administrative staff. Receipts for laboratory safety equipment that were carbon monoxide detectors for the district office building. They weren't just mismanaging the grant money, they were committing fraud, using fake documentation to cover up the theft of funds designated for student education. That's when I started filming everything. Every empty cabinet where new equipment should have been. Every broken microscope that was supposed to have been replaced. Every outdated textbook that should have been updated with grant funds. Every conversation with administrators who continued to lie about the status of our science program. I documented everything with the meticulous precision of someone trained in scientific research. Date stamps, detailed descriptions, photographic evidence, recorded conversations in states where single-party consent was legal. The February faculty meeting was where everything came to a head. Dr. Walsh was presenting the district's successful initiatives to the school board, and she had the audacity to list the NSF Science Grant as a major accomplishment, thanks to Dr. Martinez's excellent grant writing. Lincoln Regional received $100,000 to enhance our science program. She announced to applause from board members and parents in attendance. I sat in the back row, my phone recording everything, watching this woman take credit for work she'd undermined and funding she'd stolen. Our students now have access to state-of-the-art laboratory equipment and materials that will prepare them for 21st century scientific careers, Walsh continued. I looked around the room at board members, nodding approvingly, at parents beaming with pride about their children's educational opportunities. At community members who believed their tax dollars and federal grants were actually reaching students, all of them being lied to by administrators who'd stolen money meant for education and used it to fund office renovations and personal benefits. That's when I knew I had to take action that went beyond internal complaints and formal requests. I was going to sue the state. That night, I sat in my home office, surrounded by printouts of fraudulent documents. Photographs of empty lab cabinets, and recordings of administrators lying about grant implementation. The evidence was overwhelming, but the implications were terrifying. I was contemplating legal action against my employer, the school district, and potentially the state education department. As a teacher without tenure, Protection California's budget cuts had eliminated tenure for new hires, was risking my career, my livelihood, and my future in education. But every time I considered backing down, I thought about my students. Jenny Chen, whose brilliant mind deserved proper laboratory equipment to explore her passion for chemistry. Marcus Rodriguez, who'd overcome poverty and family struggles to excel in physics and dreamed of becoming an engineer. Sarah Kim, whose environmental science project on water contamination could have been groundbreaking with proper instrumentation. These kids trusted me to provide them with the best education possible. Parents sent their children to school believing that grants and funding were actually reaching classrooms. Taxpayers supported education, assuming their money was being used for student benefits. The fraud wasn't just stealing money, it was stealing opportunities, dreams, and futures. I spent weeks researching legal options, whistleblower protections for educators, federal laws regarding grant fraud, precedent cases involving misappropriation of education funds. What I discovered was both encouraging and daunting. Federal grants come with strict oversight requirements and severe penalties for misuse. The False Claims Act allows individuals to sue on behalf of the government when they discover fraud involving federal funds. Successful whistleblowers can receive substantial damages up to triple the amount of money fraudulently obtained. But I also learned that challenging school district corruption is incredibly difficult. Districts have legal teams, unlimited resources, and political connections. Teachers who blow the whistle often face retaliation, harassment, and career destruction. I needed help. Through my research, I found attorney Michael Santos, who specialized in education fraud and whistleblower cases. His initial consultation was free, and his assessment of my documentation was encouraging. Dr. Martinez, this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of education fraud I've ever seen. He said, reviewing my evidence, you have contemporaneous records, photographic documentation, recorded conversations, and a clear paper trail showing deliberate misrepresentation of grant expenditures. What are the risks? I asked. Significant, he replied honestly. The district will likely claim you're a disgruntled employee. They'll question your motives, your competence, and your credibility. They may try to have you fired or transferred. This could take years to resolve, and if we win, federal damages for grant fraud are substantial. Based on the evidence you've provided, we could be looking at several $1 million in penalties and restitution. Plus, you'd be protected under whistleblower statutes from retaliation. I thought about my students spending another year with broken equipment. I thought about future grants being stolen from other teachers who didn't have the knowledge or resources to fight back. I thought about administrators getting away with fraud while claiming they cared about education. Let's file the lawsuit, I said. The legal process was more complex than I'd anticipated. Santos explained that we'd be filing under the False Claims Act, which allows private citizens to sue on behalf of the federal government when they discover fraud involving government funds. We're essentially acting as private attorneys general, he explained. We're suing to recover money that was stolen from the federal government and used inappropriately by the school district. The first step was organizing my evidence into a comprehensive legal document called a qui tam complaint. Everything I'd documented over the past year had to be presented in a format that would convince a federal judge that fraud had occurred. We created a timeline showing exactly when the grant was awarded, when equipment should have been purchased, and when false reports were filed claiming the money had been properly spent. We included photographs of the actual state of the science program compared to what the district claimed had been accomplished. Most damaging was the paper trail. Purchase orders for equipment that didn't exist. Invoices from vendors who confirmed they'd never sold anything to the school district. Delivery receipts for materials that were never delivered to science classrooms. The beauty of your case, Santos said, is that you documented everything in real time. You weren't looking for evidence of fraud initially, you were just trying to track down missing equipment. That makes your evidence incredibly credible. But we needed more than documentation. We needed expert testimony about what $100,000 should have purchased for a science program, and what the actual impact of that equipment would have been on student education. I contacted colleagues from Stanford, professors who understood both the equipment needs of high school science programs and the educational value of proper laboratory resources. Dr. Robert Chen, my former thesis advisor, agreed to serve as an expert witness. Alina, what you've documented isn't just financial fraud, he told me after reviewing the case materials. It's educational malpractice. The equipment that should have been purchased would have transformed your students' learning experience and better prepared them for college-level science. We also needed evidence of the actual harm caused by the fraud. I gathered data on my students' college applications, documenting how many had been rejected from competitive science programs due to inadequate laboratory experience. I collected statements from parents who'd invested in private tutoring and summer programs to compensate for deficiencies in our school's science curriculum. The human cost of the fraud was staggering. Students who'd lost opportunities, parents who'd spent thousands trying to supplement their children's education, and a community that believed their school was providing excellent science instruction when it was actually failing their kids. Meanwhile, I had to continue teaching while the legal process moved forward. This meant maintaining a professional relationship with administrators who'd stolen from my program, attending meetings where they continued to lie about our science resources, and keeping quiet about the pending lawsuit that could change everything. The stress was enormous. I was teaching 6 classes a day, conducting research for the lawsuit, and trying to maintain some semblance of normal life while preparing for a legal battle that could last years. But I kept thinking about the future teachers who might receive grants and the students who deserved better than what our current system was providing. This wasn't just about recovering stolen money, it was about changing how education funding was handled and protected. 6 months after filing the initial complaint, we received news that changed everything. The federal government had decided to join our lawsuit, meaning the Department of Justice would now be pursuing the case alongside us. This is huge, Santos explained. When the federal government joins a False Claims Act case, it means they believe the evidence is strong enough to win. It also means we now have unlimited resources to pursue this fraud. The investigation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Federal investigators arrived at Lincoln Regional High School on a Tuesday morning in March, 18 months after I'd filed the lawsuit. I watched from my classroom window as agents in suits carried boxes of documents out of the administrative building. The investigation was swift and thorough. Within a week, Dr. Walsh and Janet Morrison had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the federal fraud investigation. The school board called emergency sessions to discuss the crisis, and local news media began covering what they called the $100,000 grant scandal. But the investigation revealed something much larger than anyone had anticipated. The NSF grant wasn't the only funding that had been misappropriated. Federal agents discovered a pattern of fraud involving multiple grants, donations, and special funding programs dating back 7 years. A Title I grant for low-income student support had been used to purchase luxury office furniture. A technology grant for classroom computers had funded new vehicles for administrators. Donations from local businesses for student activities had been diverted to pay for administrator travel and entertainment. The total amount of misappropriated funds exceeded $2.1 million. Dr. Martinez, Agent Jennifer Liu from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, told me during one of my interviews, "Your documentation and evidence broke this case open. Without your meticulous record-keeping, we never would have discovered the scope of this fraud." The media attention was intense, but ultimately positive. Parents were outraged to learn that funding meant for their children's education had been stolen for administrative luxuries. Community members demanded accountability and transparency in school funding. State education officials promised reforms to prevent similar fraud in other districts. But the most satisfying moment came during Dr. Walsh's deposition, which I was allowed to observe as the primary whistleblower. "Dr. Walsh," Attorney Santos asked, "can you explain why purchase orders show $100,000 spent on science equipment, but Dr. Martinez's classroom has no new equipment?" Walsh, flanked by 3 expensive attorneys hired by the district's insurance company, struggled to provide coherent answers. "The procurement process is complex," she said. "Equipment may have been delivered to alternate locations for storage and distribution. Can you identify these alternate locations? I would need to consult with our facilities manager." "Dr. Walsh, are you familiar with the federal penalties for grant fraud?" "I am not an expert in federal law." Santos then presented photograph after photograph of my empty lab cabinets, broken microscopes, and outdated textbooks. He showed the jury the fake purchase orders, the non-existent equipment, and the trail of lies that had covered up the theft. Dr. Walsh, in your professional opinion, do these photographs show a science program that has received $100,000 in new equipment and materials? The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Walsh's attorney objected to the question. The federal trial lasted 3 weeks. I testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through the grant application process. The promised equipment, the months of lies, and the systematic documentation I'd conducted. Expert witnesses explained exactly what $100,000 should have purchased and how the missing equipment had harmed student education. The defense tried to paint me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but the evidence was overwhelming. The paper trail, the photographs, the recordings, and the federal investigation had created an airtight case. On a Friday afternoon in November, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all counts of federal grant fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of the False Claims Act. But the damages award was beyond anything I'd anticipated. The federal judge awarded $2.3 million in damages and penalties. Under the False Claims Act, I was entitled to 30% of the recovery as the whistleblower who'd exposed the fraud. After legal fees and expenses, I received just over $600,000. But money wasn't the most important outcome. Dr. Walsh and Janet Morrison were criminally prosecuted and sentenced to federal prison terms. Walsh received 18 months in federal prison and was permanently barred from working in education. Morrison received 12 months and was required to pay full restitution for her role in the fraud. The school district was placed under federal oversight, with all grant and special funding requiring approval from a federal monitor. New policies were implemented, requiring quarterly audits and public reporting of all special funding expenditures. Most importantly, the recovered money was used to completely rebuild Lincoln Regional's science program. The original $100,000 grant, plus additional federal penalties, provided over $300,000 for new equipment, materials, and facility improvements. My chemistry lab now has working fume hoods, modern spectrometers, and enough microscopes for every student to have individual access. The physics lab has computer-controlled data acquisition systems, modern electrical equipment, and safety features that meet current standards. Our environmental science program has field testing equipment that allows students to conduct real research on local water and air quality. But the changes went beyond equipment. The federal case had attracted attention from education reformers, science organizations, and grant-making foundations. Lincoln Regional became a model for transparent funding management and community oversight of education resources. 3 months after the trial ended, I received a call that changed my career trajectory completely. Dr. Martinez, this is Dr. Sarah Kim from the National Science Foundation, the voice said. We've been following your case and the improvements at Lincoln Regional. We'd like to offer you a position as our regional coordinator for grant oversight and fraud prevention. The NSF position came with a substantial salary increase, the opportunity to work directly with teachers applying for grants, and the responsibility for ensuring that federal education funding actually reaches students. I now travel throughout the western United States, training educators on grant writing, helping schools implement funded programs, and investigating potential fraud. In my first year with NSF, I've helped schools receive over $8 million in science education grants, and I've identified and prevented 3 cases of potential misappropriation before they could harm student programs. But the most rewarding part of the job is the emails I receive from teachers who've successfully implemented grant-funded programs. Dr. Martinez wrote Ms. Jennifer Torres from Phoenix, thanks to the grant you helped us write and implement. Our students now have access to biotechnology equipment that's preparing them for careers in medical research. Last year, 12 of our graduates were accepted into competitive science programs. Today, I speak at education conferences about the importance of protecting grant funding and ensuring that resources reach students. The case has become a landmark example of how teachers can successfully challenge corruption and fraud in education. But the real victory isn't the money I received or the criminal convictions of corrupt administrators. It's the transformation that happened at Lincoln Regional and the ripple effects throughout the education system. My former students are now thriving in college science programs with the laboratory experience they needed to succeed. Jenny Chen is completing her PhD in chemistry at MIT. Marcus Rodriguez is studying aerospace engineering at Caltech. Sarah Kim's environmental science research led to a full scholarship at UC Berkeley and a summer internship with the EPA. These students succeeded because they finally had access to the resources that federal grants were supposed to provide all along. If you're an educator who suspects misappropriation of funding, I want you to know that you have more power than you might think. Document everything. Ask detailed questions. Request specific information about how grants and special funding are being used. Don't accept vague answers about procurement processes or compliance requirements. Federal grants come with strict accountability requirements for good reason. When schools receive taxpayer money for specific purposes, they have legal and ethical obligations to use that money exactly as promised. If you discover evidence of fraud or misappropriation, contact an attorney who specializes in whistleblower cases. The False Claims Act provides strong protections for people who expose fraud involving federal funds, and the financial incentives are designed to encourage reporting of corruption. For administrators who might be listening, understand that the days of treating education funding as a personal slush fund are over. Federal oversight is increasing, audit requirements are becoming stricter, and teachers are more aware of their rights and protections. When you steal from education grants, you're not just committing fraud against the government, you're stealing opportunities from students who deserve better. You're betraying the trust of parents who believe their children are receiving quality education. You're undermining the work of dedicated teachers who write grants and implement programs to benefit students. The cost of fraud goes far beyond money. It's measured in lost opportunities, abandoned dreams, and students who graduate unprepared for the careers they want to pursue. For students and parents, know that you have the right to know how education funding is being used. Ask questions about grants and special programs. Request to see the equipment and materials that funding was supposed to provide. If promises aren't being kept, demand accountability. Education funding belongs to students, not administrators. When it's stolen or misused, everyone loses except the people who profit from corruption. The Lincoln Regional case proved that one teacher with documentation and determination can challenge a corrupt system and win. It showed that federal law provides real protection for whistleblowers who expose education fraud, and it demonstrated that the truth, when properly documented and legally presented, is more powerful than any administrative cover-up. Because sometimes, the teacher who asks too many questions about missing grant money is the only thing standing between corrupt administrators and the theft of student opportunities. Sometimes the person who films everything and keeps detailed records becomes the hero who saves education funding for future generations. And sometimes, suing the state isn't just about recovering stolen money, it's about protecting the integrity of education and ensuring that resources reach the students who need them most.